Why are we focusing on MSM, men who have sex with men, gay and bisexual men, and the issue of HIV and AIDS? So you can see the CDC estimates over 56,000 people became infected with HIV/AIDS in the United States in 2006. And amongst the different risk categories, the largest one is men who have sex with men. So men who have sex with men represent 53% of the infections in the United States. So we represent 4% of the population and represent more than half of the infections in any given year.
The majority to great majority of new infections in African male-female couples arose from main sex partners, and particularly in their research from sex partners that people lived with. And this was published about maybe 2 years ago in The Lancet, and it has really important implications for HIV prevention, because in our US model we have this great pool of individual level interventions where we talk to individuals about their behavior. But in fact, if risk arises within couples, then maybe we need to be talking to couples about HIV prevention. Did a modeling study using data from a survey of 10,000 MSM, including a number in Chicago that was done at CDC. And our goal was to estimate what % of HIV transmissions among MSM in the United States arose from main partners. And so our conclusion was that this bar on the left represents the percentage of transmission that comes from main sex partners. And main sex partners we define in the interview by describing this is a guy that you would call, that you feel committed to above all others, somebody you might call your husband, your boyfriend, your significant other. And we estimated overall that 68% of HIV infections among MSM in the United States come from main partners. And if you look over to the right where there are these bars by age, you can see that among the younger guys, 18 to 24 and 25 to 29-year-old, that was more like 80 to 85% of infections come from main partners. And the last point I want to make is that there was a difference in when transmissions occurred within partnerships as to between main and casual partners. So when transmissions were modeled to occur from main partners, in most cases 55% of those transmissions are where the person who got infected believed his partner was negative. And a smaller proportion, the smallest proportion, was where he believed that partner to be positive. And in contrast, if you look at transmissions that occurred from casual partners, those were much more likely to occur from partners whose serostatus was unknown.
First, I want to just define what I mean by sexual agreement. So it's whether the decision that couples make about whether or not to have sex outside the relationship, and that includes a monogamous agreement. So several couples, when they came to the study, they said, oh, we don't have an agreement because we're monogamous, but that we consider an agreement. And some couples, not many, but some, also had implicit agreements. So they hadn't necessarily talked directly to each other about the agreement, but they definitely had an understanding of what it was. And usually it was the same understanding, interestingly. So we wanted to know what the role of agreements were for these couples. And we found that sexual agreements are a very important aspect of gay male relationships. For one, they foster trust. So we heard couples say, you know, I'm monogamous, I trust my partner not to have sex outside the relationship, and that allows us to have unprotected sex with each other. And that trust was really valued. And trust was important for non-monogamous couples too. You know, I trust my partner not to fall in love with somebody else, or not to be risky outside when he's with somebody else, and bring it home to me. And that was valued. They also provided structure for some couples. Some couples talked about how it provided structure. They kind of knew where they were. They knew what the boundaries of the relationship were. And at a time when, well, in California there's on-again, off-again gay marriage, but when there aren't a lot of structures for gay couples, this was one that provided support and structure that was quite valued by couples. They also provided sexual enhancement. A lot of couples had three-way sex together, and that, you know, they'd be out having three ways, but that kind of enhanced the sex that they had together. Sometimes a medical condition might come up where one of the partners had a lower sexual desire, or, you know, sexual side effects from a medication, and the partner who was more sexual, they'd open up the relationship so that he could have sex outside. And then finally, a lot of couples liked having agreements, and this was mostly open agreements, because it kind of was a non-heteronormative way to have a relationship. They liked not being kind of a more traditional hetero relationship, and it kind of supported their gay identity and was really valued in terms of how they felt about their relationship. We also found that HIV prevention was not the primary motivator for having a sexual agreement, that really it was more about having a satisfying and loving relationship. Different types of relationships, I mean, we talk about them a lot as open, closed, monogamous, non-monogamous, but there's really everything in between. For example, some couples had agreements that were where they were just open for 3 ways only, so whenever they had sex outside the relationship, they were both there together. Many had open agreements with some kind of restriction about who, where, when. And interestingly, a lot of those restrictions had to do with preserving the relationship. So for example, you can only have sex with the person once, never in our house, never let it interrupt our plans, only when you travel, things like that. Many just said, as long as it's safe. Some were very specific about what safe was, not all of them. And some were just it's totally open, whatever. And then, of course, it included implicit and explicit agreements. There's 2 levels of discrepancies within agreements that I want to talk about. One is when couples aren't invested to the same degree in their investment, I see as potentially problematic. The other discrepancy that I think is important to address are that 8% in our sample where one person thought the agreement was monogamous and the other thought it was open. We looked at these couples specifically and compared them to monogamous couples and non-monogamous couples. And these couples scored lower on a lot of the positive relationship variables like agreement investment, intimacy, trust, commitment, attachment, equality. They had much worse communication and had a lot of avoidant communication, which is not really surprising. So in terms of agreement negotiation, that also is a highly varied process, but we kind of clumped it into 3 areas. A lot of couples, we found, discuss their agreements early on in the relationship and then never again. And I call that agreement drift, because what happens is we would interview, and in this study, we interviewed both partners separately. So we have data from both partners, which is why we can get at discrepancies, which I think is a real bonus. But they'd say, yeah, we talked about it early on, and we decided to be monogamous, and we still are, 10 years later. And then you talk to the other partner, and you'd say, yeah, we talked about it early on, and we decided to be monogamous, and it's been 10 years, so no, of course we're not monogamous anymore, On the other hand, some had ongoing, very fluid conversations about their agreement frequently. So, it could just be, they might have a sexual encounter, a 3-way, and they would check in with each other to make sure that, both felt that it was a good situation for them, or, did you get more attention than I did, and how did I feel about that, or how did you feel about that? And they would kind of make adjustments very, very nicely and easily and fluidly. And then a lot of couples would negotiate and renegotiate based on the needs of the relationship. Agreements break also. In our sample, 32% reported that they had broken their agreement in the last 12 months, and of those who broke their agreement, 53% did not disclose the break to their primary partner. And legitimately, people felt like it was very difficult to disclose a broken agreement and that it would be harmful to the relationship. But non-disclosure, not only can it lead to risk for HIV infection and other STIs, but we found that it can threaten the relationship because people talked about feeling guilty about not disclosing, and that it created a wedge or kind of distance in the relationship that was equally very uncomfortable as well. Okay, so why do guys break their agreements? So I have the 5 most common reasons that guys broke their agreements. And I'll start with number 5 was, most men who find themselves in the same situation would have broken their agreement too. Number 4, I didn't have to worry about becoming infected with HIV by my partner. Number 3, someone wanted to have sex with me. Number 2, the guy was really hot. And the number 1 reason for breaking their agreement was, I was horny. And I say this because these are all individual level factors. So I'm here studying relationships and talking to you about the importance of relationships and relationship factors and variables, and, but we can't forget about the individual and situational factors at play. So in sum, agreements are a ubiquitous and integral part of relationships. HIV prevention is not the primary motivator for having agreements, and it's critical for both partners to have the same understanding of their agreement. In conclusion, gay couples place a high degree of importance on their primary relationships and strive to keep them strong. Positive relationship factors are associated with less risk with outside partners. And agreements can support relationships. However, discrepant agreements are associated with risk, and undisclosed broken agreements may increase risk and have a negative effect on relationships. So in the end, I feel that supporting men's relationships and agreements will likely reduce risk for HIV.